everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the story called Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which is otherwise known as the story that the movie The Arrival is based on. And I read it in this short story collection, Stories of Your Life and Others, which was published in 2002. So obviously, you can tell by the Hollywood movie, people have really latched onto this story, and I also found it really compelling, both the first time that I read it and all the times after that. And one of the reasons for that was the really powerful way that Ted Chiang uses nonlinear storytelling. So today I want to look at some of the ways that he does that, what makes it really successful, and hopefully, as you know, how I can apply that to my own writing, and hopefully some ways that you can too. Just a note that this video will be very spoilery, so if you haven't read this story, you might want to go and read it and then come back here. So with that, let's jump into it. So this story is about a linguist named Louise who's hired to study and to learn from this mysterious species of aliens that suddenly arrives on Earth. And then these sections of the story are interspersed with sections that talk about Louise's relationship with her daughter. And the unusual part about these is that they're told in the future tense. So the parts with the daughter actually take place after the main storyline that talks about Louise and her interactions with the aliens. And actually, the first time I read the story, I was a little bit confused by that. But in the end, I thought it was one of the most compelling and interesting parts of the story. So today, I want to look at why that works and hopefully what I can take away from it. So the first big point here is that the structure of the story, this sort of nonlinear interspersed structure, is intrinsically tied to the narrative and to the main twist or the main plot point of the story. So again, this is going to be full of spoilers, but basically the idea is that the aliens, which are called heptapods, think in a non-linear way, a non-teleological way, and this way of thinking is embodied by their language, which Louise is studying. And the more she studies it and the more she gets immersed in it, the more she starts to think like them until the point that she can actually see the future. So all of these stories about her daughter and these sections of the stories that feature her daughter take place after Louise starts to think in this way that's influenced by the heptapods. And the moment that the story is in, the present moment, is the point when she and her partner decide to have the daughter, with Louise reflecting both on the past and on the future and how the two bleed into each other in a way. So you can see that this nonlinear storytelling is extremely necessary, and it almost feels inevitable as far as the main twist of the story with the aliens thinking in this nonlinear way. It doesn't feel like Ted Chiang just threw in that nonlinearity for the sake of being literary, but rather it feels like there's no other way almost that he could have written it. So to generalize out here to a bigger takeaway, I think the main thing that I learned from this is that the nonlinearity has to have a purpose, and it has to feel connected to the story as a whole, whether that's connected to a character who can see the future, like in this case, or a character whose head is stuck in the past, so to speak, or a situation where events in the past or the future really deeply influence each other and parallel each other. Like, regardless of what the situation is, the nonlinear storytelling structure has to feel like it's an inevitable way of telling a story. So the second thing that Chiang does that I think makes his nonlinearity work really well is that on a scene-by-scene level, the future tense interludes are tied to the events of the past tense narrative. So basically, the future tense parts talking about the daughter are tied to the past tense parts talking about Louise and her growing relationship with the heptapods. And this is oftentimes in some pretty literal ways. So for example, one section that's talking about the aliens ends when Louise says, "We need a better grasp on this writing system before we begin anything else. Patience, good sir, patience is a virtue." And then the interlude right after it that describes Louise and her daughter, and where Louise says, "Sometimes it's good to wait, I'll say. The anticipation makes it more fun when you get there." So you can see that these two lines, even though she's talking to different people, are really closely related to each other, and you can almost see how Louise, now that she's thinking of the past and the present almost as one entity, you can see how those two lines would become meshed with each other in her mind, and therefore they do in Chiang's storytelling as well. So not only that, but I think that this linking of the past and future sections of the story is really helpful to the reader in terms of keeping the reader's attention, because a lot of the future tense sections are actually pretty mundane events. Like obviously in the past tense, it's pretty interesting to be thinking about aliens and learning a new language and how do you explain physics to an alien species who has completely different technology and ways of thinking. But for the future tense ones, it's oftentimes really mundane events. So for the one that I just quoted from, it's actually from a section where Louise's daughter is complaining about how she can't wait to go on their trip to Hawaii. So it's a super everyday, average kind of event, but it takes on new meaning because of the way that it connects in a very strong parallel to these past events that have just been mentioned. And we get to see as readers how these sort of thematically related moments converge on each other in Louise's mind. And in this new system of thinking where linear time is not the main principle of organization. One really interesting thing here, I think, is that this thematic linking makes the nonlinear story feel less nonlinear in a way. Like when you think of the word nonlinear, it sort of implies like going back and forth between different topics, different events, different times in almost a disjointed way. But because Chiang does such a good job of linking the two timelines together, it doesn't feel like that at all. So we can follow Louise's thought process even if the way that she's thinking about it is completely foreign to how we would think about it in our normal human lives. One quote that I really love, which I feel like encapsulates this perfectly, is, "I found myself in a meditative state, contemplating the way in which premises and conclusions were interchangeable. There was no train of thought moving along a particular route. All the components in an act of reasoning were equally powerful." So again, we see here how this nonlinear structure is tied to the theme of the story and the big twist and concept that the story is exploring, as shown in this quote, and also how just different ideas in different times converge upon each other in Louise's mind and in Chiang's writing, which allows the reader to really experience it as Louise herself is experiencing it. So finally, the third big thing that I want to talk about here that Chiang does is that he reveals the ending at the beginning. I think one of the big advantages of linear storytelling is that the reader discovers things alongside the characters, and so suspense sort of naturally builds up towards the end and towards the conclusion, and we're on that journey with the characters. And we can't know the ending until we get there and they themselves find out what it is. But Chiang fully subverts this sort of convention of linear storytelling by revealing at the very beginning of the story how Louise's relationship with her daughter is going to turn out. So from the first page, he drops hints like this. "The right time to do that would be when you're ready to have children of your own, and we'll never get that chance." In this case, Louise, and throughout the story, she's addressing her daughter as you. Here, Chiang is hinting, Louise won't get the chance to see her daughter be ready to have children. Of course, this could sort of mean everything, like maybe she just won't have kids, but he's dropping these hints and foreshadowing from the very first page, as we find out soon. Because a few pages later, we learn that Louise's daughter dies in a mountaineering accident and she's only 25, and that's, of course, why she never has kids. So the reader knows this, and Louise knows this, which actually makes the story even more interesting because it moves the mystery and the question in the reader's minds away from the question of what literally happens to the daughter and towards even more fascinating questions like, how does Louise know the future? What circumstances make her decide to stay on the same course even though she knows the tragic ending? Is that even a choice for her? Like, could she have decided to step off that path? So she says early on in that quote that I just cited that she wants to tell her daughter the story of the moment when she and the father decide to have her. But Louise knows that she won't get the chance to do that. And this whole story, sort of the story not only of the daughter's birth, but of her entire life, of her relationship with Louise, is encapsulated in the story that Chiang writes. And so that brings up the question of, like, why didn't Louise find another way to tell that story if she knew she wasn't going to get the chance to tell it in the way that she initially wanted to? And then that brings up the question of, like, maybe this written story is the way that she's finding to tell her daughter about this, because of course it is written in the second person addressed to you, meaning her daughter, and so on and so forth. So many of these fascinating questions that I think make the story even more gripping than if the question was just what happened to her daughter, why is she not here, what happened in their relationship. By getting that out in the air early on, Chiang opens the door for even more of these questions. So not only does he open up these fascinating questions, but Chiang also keeps the reader's attention in another way, which is by slowly revealing how the form, this nonlinear form, is connected to the content and to the big twist that the heptapods don't see time linearly, and therefore that Louise has learned not to see time linearly. Personally, as a reader, my mind was completely blown when I read this the first time and found out why the story was written in this nonlinear form and what effects Louise had felt from her interactions with the heptapods. And throughout the story, Chiang lays out such a delightful journey and evolution of discovery, from the first interaction with the heptapods to sort of deciphering the basics of their language to their science, and then finally to this sort of almost enlightenment, or just this different mental state that Louise reaches at the end. So even though he reveals the ending of one part of the story, the mother-daughter relationship, early on, he keeps this part of the story in reserve and preserves that for the suspense of the reader. And then I think another thing, the last thing that kept me really, really engaged with the story, was the way that he sort of interweaves these really fascinating details about linguistics and about physics that made me really feel like I was immersed in the world of these experts in their fields who are really like discovering all of these things for the first time in their interactions with the heptapods, but are extremely knowledgeable about their areas of expertise and research within the human context. So I learned about all sorts of things that I had no idea about before. Something like semasiographic, I don't know how you pronounce it, semasiographic writing systems, which is the kind of writing systems that the heptapods have, things like that. And I was just completely convinced by Louise's experience and her portrayal as an expert. And so knowing that I was going to learn actual things from this story and just continually be amazed by the depth of knowledge there was something else that kept me super engaged, even despite the fact, or even while I knew the ending of one element of the story at least. So overall, I think what I learned from this was the power of really leaning into that nonlinear form and even revealing the ending or parts of the ending from the outset so you can get to even more fascinating questions through that form. Basically taking advantage of the nonlinear form instead of working around it. And again, avoiding nonlinearity for its own sake, avoiding just putting it in because it feels literary or it feels like something that should be there or would make the piece more artistic or something like that. I have to admit this does seem really tricky because you have to think outside of the sort of standards and patterns of linear time and linear story structure that a lot of us, myself included, are used to writing in. But it does seem like a really cool challenge and I'd love to try it in my writing. So there you have it, 3 ways that Ted Chiang uses nonlinearity to really amazing effect in his story of your life. I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether it's about this nonlinear form, reading or writing it, whether it's about the story or about the movie, which I actually haven't seen, and I'm really curious to know if anyone's seen it, whether they leverage a lot of the same techniques or whether they sort of take it off in a different direction. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when I post a new video. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.